Bryce-Pease is our correspondent in New York and he joins us live. Sherwin, thank you so much for joining us on the Globe. Now, we've seen Madiba's centenary birthday celebrations taking place around the world. Take us through what's happening at the New York Stock Exchange at the Nasdaq.
Well, it's actually the Nasdaq, and we are on the floor here of their studio. And just moments away, South Africa's ambassador to the United Nations, Jerry Machila, joined by a team from South African Tourism, will be ringing the closing bell, 4 p.m. local time, 10 p.m. your time. And as you mentioned, this is the beginning of what is going to be, Lulu, a global event. I was also just told moments ago that the spire above One World Trade Center, essentially the tallest building in the United States, the Freedom Tower, the spire atop that tower will be lit in the South African flag and the colors of the South African flag on Nelson Mandela Day. Of course, the United Nations will be leading events in the United States around the 18th of July centenary. There's a event at the United Nations that will feature a keynote address by none other than actor and UN messenger of peace, Forrest Whitaker. So while you'll have former President Barack Obama at the Wanderers Stadium in Johannesburg giving us the Nelson Mandela lecture on the 17th, we have Forrest Whitaker talking at the United Nations the day after. There are a number of community service events here and just a great deal of enthusiasm where you are, really wanting to put South Africa, using this moment to put South Africa on the stage. South African tourism officials telling me they want to promote South Africa, they want to use this opportunity to promote it as a travel destination. So a lot going on here, Lulu.
Now, Sherwin, there's a lot of excitement that is taking place, as you mentioned, in South Africa. Now, tell us about what Americans are saying on the ground. What's the feeling like? Madiba is a global icon, and when spoken about, even young children know who he is.
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer because Nelson Mandela Day is not, for example, as big a day in the United States, for example, as it might be in South Africa, certainly at the United Nations. So what the United Nations has been doing is really to drive its message, the legacy of former President Nelson Mandela, the ideals that he stood for, the leadership qualities that this world needs now more than ever, and really using their missions around the world to promote this day. Of course, 4th of July in the United States is certainly, Independence Day is a far bigger occasion here. But really, this is not a day that has been on the books for that long. It's a new initiative. I mean, it's less than a decade old. And so one expects that over time it will grow. And we are beginning to see that there are a number of events that are planned, certainly in New York City. Of course, this is the city that Nelson Mandela, the first major international trip that he made after his release from prison in 1990, then the first black mayor of New York, David Dinkins, was presiding as mayor in New York. So there was a lot of symbolism, a lot of history made on that trip. Of course, he was accompanied then by his wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela. It was the first time he addressed the General Assembly as the deputy president of the ANC. Of course, returning triumphantly in 1994 as the first black president of a democratic society. So New York in particular, Lulu, does hold a very special place in the Mandela family, and certainly in the body politic that is the African National Congress.
Now, Sharon, just speak to us about the Nelson Mandela Peace Summit that the UN General Assembly will be hosting in September.
Well, this was an initiative by the South African government, led, of course, by Ambassador Jerry Machila. And they pushed for this resolution. They got the Africa group on board, and this went to a resolution vote in December last year. And it was actually a decision taken through consensus. And I think, we've had so many discussions on this program, the two of us, Lulu, talking about the intractable conflicts around the world, the intransigence we see in the Security Council, the difficulty, and often what people call the increased irrelevance of the United Nations in terms of fixing problems around the world. The South Africans have said, let us use this legacy, let us use this example, and let's create a Nelson Mandela Peace Summit. Let's do it around the time that heads of state and government are coming to New York for the General Assembly in September anyway. And so what they're doing is, just before the high-level segment of the annual General Assembly meeting gets off, they will have a peace summit in Nelson Mandela's name. And I don't think, anyone that reads the news or the newspaper newspapers every day can argue with the sentiment that the South Africans are trying to express here, that he was an example of peace. He was an example of peace even when many people thought he would come out of prison angry, and they want to use that champion that legacy, really to frame the discussions that we have in the Security Council, the discussions we have in the General Assembly, and the peace discussions that are needed to happen so that conflicts around the world, whether you're talking about Syria, with Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, and so on, the list is long. Let us put Nelson Mandela's legacy and his message at the center of those discussions, and maybe we can see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Sherwin, thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now.